The Mystery of the Double, Geographic Medicine. You will have realized that something very important for an understanding of spiritual knowledge, in connection with human life, was said at yesterday's public lecture. I suggested that there are people nowadays who prefer, while they are on the physical plane, to take in only ideas that derive from the sense-perceptible world, ideas that can be won only by an intellect that relates solely to the sense-perceptible world, while rejecting anything else. I said that after their death, such people are bound to an environment that still retains leanings toward the earthly, physical region in which we live between birth and death. In the way they live in the physical body, such people condemn themselves to a long sojourn in the earthly physical world, even after they have died, thus causing destructive forces to be created within this physical world. This touches on profound and important esoteric matters that have to do with human life. Esoteric matters that have been painstakingly guarded for centuries, indeed millennia, by certain secret societies. These societies have maintained, by what right we shall not investigate just now, that human beings are too immature to receive such truths or secrets, and that revealing them would give rise to much bewilderment. Today we shall not go into the right by which such profoundly incisive truths that are so important for human life have been withheld and only cultivated within the closed circle of esoteric schools. But what has to be said is that the time has now come when humanity at large can, indeed must, no longer be left in ignorance of certain secrets about the supersensible world, such as those I mentioned yesterday. Within certain bounds, it was justified in former times, when circumstances were different, to keep such esoteric matters hidden. But now this is no longer the case. As we know, we are now living in the fifth post-Atlantean epoch. It is a time when the conditions pertaining to human life are such that to go through the gate of death would entail becoming a destroyer, unless one had spent this life searching increasingly for inner pictures, concepts, and ideas about supersensible matters. So we can no longer agree with those who maintain that we might as well wait and see what will happen when we die. We cannot do this, because it is necessary for us to know now, between our birth and our death, about certain matters concerning the spiritual world, as I pointed out yesterday, in order to be in possession of these inner pictures and ideas when we step through the gate of death. This was not the same in earlier periods of human evolution. As you know, up to the 16th century, when the Copernican view was presented, people had quite different beliefs about the structure of the universe. Obviously, it was necessary for human progress, and to enable human freedom to enter into the evolution of humanity, that the Copernican view of the world should make its appearance on the scene, just as it is now necessary for spiritual science to appear. Nevertheless, the physical view of the world, which people had before the arrival of Copernicanism, call it wrong if you wish, that view of a physical world in which the earth stood still while the sun and the stars circled round its skies, and where, beyond those skies, there was a spiritual sphere where spiritual beings lived, that was a view which human beings could still take with them through the gate of death, without being held back in the earthly sphere once they had died. It was a view of the world which did not cause them to become destroyers in the earthly sphere once they had passed through the gate of death. But when Copernicanism burst upon the scene, it brought a view of the whole universe spread out in space, ruled only by spatial laws. And it was when Copernicanism showed the earth circling round the sun that this view bound human beings to physical, sense-perceptible existence, and prevented them from rising up into the spiritual world in the appropriate way after death. This drawback of the Copernican worldview has to be acknowledged today, despite the fact that preparations were made for centuries to bring this wonderful advancement to human souls. Both sides are equally justified. The one side shows how clever it is, though in the interim the opinion that the Copernican worldview is the only satisfying one now shows this cleverness up to be somewhat Philistine. Nevertheless, it is still clever. But the other side, that this Copernican worldview ties human beings to the earth after they have died, if they have not gained a spiritual view, is regarded by people today as foolishness. Yet it is the truth. You know even from the Bible that some things which human beings call foolishness are in fact wisdom to the gods. When a human being steps through the gate of death, his consciousness changes. So it would be wrong to believe that you are unconscious after death. Yet this strange idea is fairly widespread, even in circles that call themselves theosophical. It is nonsense, however, for consciousness then becomes, on the contrary, much mightier, much more intensive, but it is different. Even as far as our ordinary ideas about the physical world go, it has to be said that our conscious ideas after death are different. Most importantly, it is after death that people unite with those with whom they have been karmically linked in life. It can happen that someone who has died encounters many human souls in the spiritual world between death and a new birth. He passes through these souls, for here things are permeable, not impermeable, or moves past them, but as far as he is concerned, they are not there. Those who are there for him are the ones with whom he is karmically linked in some way. To grow together more and more into a general world coherence, also after death, is something we have to work for through our life here on earth. Founding societies that are built purely on spirit is therefore one of our tasks now and in the future. Why do we endeavor to found societies such as the Anthroposophical Society? Why do we seek to unite people under the heading of such ideas? We do it so as to create karmic links between individuals who are to find one another in the spiritual world, which is something they could not do if they were to go around here all alone. By enabling people to share spiritual knowledge and spiritual wisdom amongst each other, we create immense opportunities for their life in the spiritual world. And this in turn works back to the physical, sense-perceptible world, which is constantly influenced by the spiritual world. In fact, what we have here are only the effects. For even when we are here on the physical plane, the causes happen over there in the spiritual world. There is so much propaganda about such things today, when societies are set up for all kinds of reasons, and often with the greatest of enthusiasm. But few are devoted to spiritual matters. People think that some of these societies will gradually change the world into an earthly paradise. Well, there were plenty of them 3 years ago, before this war broke out, and a good many people were working toward transforming Europe into just such an earthly paradise. But our situation now does not hold out much hope that events can be directed in the way people had hoped. In other ways, though, collaboration of the physical with the spiritual world is more complicated. Nevertheless, it has to be said that if societies are founded in the light of spiritual science, this means that through them people collaborate not only with the world of effects, but also with the world of the causes that underlie the world of effects. We must imbue ourselves with this feeling entirely, if we are to understand rightly the immeasurable and profound significance of what is achieved through living together in spiritual collaboration now and in the future of humanity. This is not something that can be gained on the basis of any kind of clubby fellowship, for it is a sacred task laid upon present and future humanity by the divine spiritual beings who govern the world. People will be unable to avoid taking in at least some inner conceptions about the supersensible world, because such conceptions will less and less be forthcoming from the sense-perceptible world. By its very progress, science will increasingly drive conceptions about the supersensible world out of the world of the senses. If human beings failed to take in any supersensible spiritual concepts, this would eventually exclude them entirely from the spiritual world. They would be condemning themselves to becoming, after death, totally bound up with the physical earth alone, and with what the physical earth will one day become. Since the physical earth will become a corpse in the future, human beings would thus be facing the frightful prospect of condemning themselves to inhabiting a corpse in the guise of its soul, if they failed to decide that they must learn how to live in the spiritual world and take root there. A most important task has thus indeed been set for the cultivation of spiritual science. Once every day we should fill our soul with this sacred thought, so as never again to lose our enthusiasm for this matter of spiritual science. All those inner conceptions, which can multiply more and more if we join in with the many concepts about the spiritual world, which have already come from that world into our spiritual stream, all these conceptions that are coming to us enable us to free ourselves from being bound to the earth, to what is destructive in the earthly realm, so that we can derive our work from another direction. So we do remain linked with the souls we have left behind on the earth, and with those with whom we are karmically connected, and also with the earth, but from the direction of other realms. We are in fact more intensively linked with the souls left behind on the earth when our links with them derive from higher spiritual realms, and when we are not condemned by a purely materialistic way of life to haunt the earth like ghosts without being linked through love with anything on it, but are turned instead into focuses of destruction. We know how from childhood onward we develop our consciousness here on earth, and how it grows and thrives. There is no need to describe this here. But after death, quite other processes are at work, by which we gradually achieve the consciousness we need for our life between death and a new birth. Here on the earth we go about, learn things and have experiences, but this is not what happens after death. There is no longer any need for this then. What must then happen is that we have to detach from ourselves something immensely intensive which is tied up with us once we have left our physical body behind. Having passed through the gate of death, we come into a relationship with the spiritual world, described here by spiritual science. We grow together with it. We have described this as the world of the higher hierarchies, the angeloi, archangeloi, archai, the exousiai, dunamis, curiotites, and so on. The world of the higher hierarchies, together with their deeds and experiences. Here on earth, the world is outside us. The world of the mineral, plant, and animal kingdoms is in our environment. But when we have passed through the gate of death, the spiritual beings we list as the higher hierarchies, and indeed their very worlds, are within us. We are bound up with them and can at first not distinguish ourselves from them. We live in them and they imbue us entirely. This is a difficult concept to come to grips with, but we have to make ourselves familiar with it. Here we are outside the world. There we are within the world. Our own being spreads out all over the whole world, but we cannot distinguish ourselves from it. After death we are as though stuffed full of the beings of the higher hierarchies, and with whatever it is that they are doing. Most importantly, what we have to do is detach the more lofty hierarchies from the one that is closest to us, the hierarchy of angeloi, archangeloi, and archai, which fills us entirely. I've described in other lectures and contexts how our I consciousness grows and matures in a proper way. Over there, we cannot achieve a proper I consciousness if we do not have the strength to distinguish what is in me. Is it an angelos? Is it one of the Elohim? What is a being from the hierarchy of the angeloi? What is a being from the hierarchy of the exousiai, the spirits of form? Over there, we have to learn to distinguish, and we have to have the strength to detach what we want to perceive from what is bound up with us. Otherwise it is in us and not there outside us. Here on earth we have to link up with what is outside us and look at it. Over there we have to detach it from ourselves in order to be linked with it. At the stage the world has now reached in human evolution, we must acquire spiritual concepts if we want to detach from ourselves something we would otherwise carry within us only as though asleep. People find these spiritual concepts awkward because they have to make some effort, more effort than would be necessary for ordinary concepts. But if they acquire them, then, after death, these concepts develop tremendous power. And it is this power alone that gives us the ability to recognize and comprehend the spiritual world. This is exceedingly important. People today feel uncomfortable if they have to acquire spiritual concepts. They like going to meetings where they are shown lantern slides or similar things, and therefore do not have to think in a supersensible way. They like to see things in front of them, or at least hear lectures that tell them only about what they anyway always have before their eyes. People today shy away from making an effort to ascend to concepts that are more difficult here, because they have no outer object, since their objects are the facts that relate to the supersensible world. Over there, however, these concepts are the forces which actually bring the reality of the world to us. Through spiritual ideas and concepts, we gain the wisdom we need in order to have light over there where otherwise everything will be in darkness. What we attain here in the way of wisdom is light, spiritual light, over there. Wisdom is spiritual light. We need wisdom in order not to find ourselves in darkness over there. Not to acquire spiritual concepts is the best way of having no light over there. And when one has no light, one moves away again from the sphere into which one ought to be casting light. One drifts back to earth and wanders about there as a focus of destruction. At most one might be used from time to time by a black magician in order to provide inspiration for certain quite specific functions, but also for destructive activities on the earth. Wisdom, then, is something we need so that we can have light after death. But there is something else we need after death as well: the ability to detach the beings of the spiritual world in order to be able to confront them is not the only thing we need, for we also have to have the faculty of love. If we did not have this, we would be unable to develop a proper relationship with the beings whom wisdom enables us to perceive. We need the faculty of love. However, the love engendered here on the earth is for the most part dependent on our physical body. This love is a feeling, and it depends on the rhythm of breathing here in the physical world. It is not the kind of love that we can take with us into the spiritual world. It would be a complete illusion to believe that we can take this love over with us into the spiritual world, especially the kind of love we develop here at this particular time. What we do take over into the spiritual world is all the power of the love we acquire here in the physical world through perceiving this world with our senses, through living with this physical world. This love is fired in us by the understanding we can develop of the physical world as we live here in it. If we take into our feeling life specifically those experiences we can have in viewing the world by means of modern science, this leads to love developing for when we are over on the other side. Love, however, is something that can be either high or low, depending on the realm in which it unfolds. If you pass through the gate of death, and then have to remain in the earth realm as a focus of destruction, well, this is also due to having developed great love. The fact that you have to remain like this is a consequence of your having been bound up with purely naturalistic concepts. But then you employ this love for works of destruction. You love the work of destruction and are condemned to observe yourself loving the work of destruction. Love, then, is noble if you can rise up to higher worlds and love what you gain through spiritual concepts. We must on no account forget this. Love is lowly when it works in a lowly sphere, and it is noble and high and spiritual when it works in a spiritual sphere. This is the essential point to be remembered. If you remain unaware of this, you will be unable to discern things in the right way. People today must become familiar with ideas like these pertaining to the human being's life after death. For humanity as it is today, and especially as it will be in the near future, it is no longer sufficient for people to be told by preachers that they should believe something or other, and that they must prepare for eternal life if these preachers are incapable of describing what it looks like in the world human beings go to after passing through the gate of death. In former times, when scientific, naturalistic concepts did not yet exist, and because people had not yet become infected with the merely material interests which have gained so much ground since the 16th century, it was in order for preachers to talk about the supersensible world in the way the various religious denominations still want to talk today. But this is not in order now. In deep compassion for humanity, it unfortunately has to be said that people today often become ensnared for the very reason that they want to promote their own eternal bliss in an egoistic way via the religious denominations. By this very means, they become excessively ensnared in the physical, sense-perceptible natural world, thus blocking their own ascent once they have passed through the gate of death. This is yet another reason why it is necessary to emphasize profoundly how important it is for humanity to occupy itself with spiritual science in the present time and in the future. For those who are unable to form ideas about the life after death deserve the utmost commiseration. One of many reasons for the need to try and spread the word about spiritual science is that it must be done out of deepest sympathy for people, because it is so lamentable if from lack of understanding they continue to resist making any approach to the ideas of spiritual science. The spiritual world is everywhere, and we must be quite clear about this. Only think of the world in which the dead are with the dead, that supersensible world with the threads which link the dead with the living, who have been left behind, and the threads which link the dead with the higher hierarchies. All this belongs to the world in which we find ourselves. As truly as the air is all around us, just as truly is that world always around us too. We are not at all separated off from that world, for it is only different states of consciousness that separate us from the world we move in after death. This must be clearly emphasized, for even within our circles, not all our friends are really clear about the fact that the dead person finds the living person once more, in all his fullness, and that we are only separated so long as the one here is in a physical body, and the other there without a physical body. All these forces which bring us close to the dead have to be attained by means of our letting go of them. If we do not do this, we have them within us, and thus cannot perceive them. Then we must also attain the ability to bring across into the proper sphere the power of love, which develops through the naturalistic ideas that are here, for otherwise this power will become an evil power for us over there. That love in particular which develops through naturalistic ideas could otherwise become an evil power. A power or force as such is neither good nor evil. It can be one or the other, depending on which sphere it appears in. Just as we are linked with that supersensible world where the dead are, so does the supersensible world also reach out into the physical sense-perceptible world in another way as well. The cosmos is indeed complicated, and we can only come to grasp it slowly and gradually, but we must have the will to grasp it. The spiritual world reaches out into our world. Everything is interspersed with the spiritual world. In everything that is sense-perceptible, there is also something that is not sense-perceptible. Human beings ought to be especially interested in that part of the supersensible which has to do with their own sense-perceptible nature. So, please consider what I am going to say carefully, for it is an extremely important image. We human beings are structured according to body, soul, and spirit. But this does not account for our whole being by a long way. Our body, our soul, and our spirit are what we are immediately concerned with, as belonging to our consciousness. But this is by a long way not all that our existence involves. What I now want to describe is connected with certain secrets of human evolution, of human nature. And these too must now become known, and ever better known. When a human being enters earthly existence through birth, he gains, on the one hand, the possibility of giving a means of existence to his soul through his physical body. Please take note of this. But on the other hand, a person does not know his physical body at all well. What an extraordinary number of things go on in our body of which we know nothing. Then gradually we do begin to learn through anatomy and physiology something of what goes on there, although this is not at all a particularly adequate way of learning these things. If we had to wait before taking any nourishment until we understood about the digestive processes, well, it is pointless even to mention that we would starve. For it is unthinkable that we can know what our organs have to do in order to process our food for our organism. So, we arrive in this world with the garment of our organism, without being able to reach down into it with our soul to any great extent. Instead, shortly before we are born, not very long before we are born, there is also an opportunity for another spiritual being, apart from our soul, to take possession of our body, namely of the subconscious part of our body. This is a fact. Shortly before we are born, another being indwells us. In the terminology we use today, we would call this an aromatic being. It is just as much in us as is our own soul. These beings lead their lives by making use of human beings to enable them to inhabit the sphere in which they wish to dwell. They have an exceptionally high degree of intelligence and a very significantly developed will, but no qualities of soul, nothing like what we would call the human qualities of soul and heart and mind. So, we proceed through our life while having our soul and also a double who is far cleverer than we are. Very intelligent, but with a Mephistophelian intelligence, an aromatic intelligence, and in addition also an aromatic will, a very strong will, a will that is much more akin to the forces of nature than it is to our human will, which is ruled by our heart and mind. In the 19th century, science discovered that our nervous system is interspersed with forces of electricity. Science was quite right. But the scientists are wrong if they believe that the nervous force which belongs to us and which provides the foundation for our inner world of pictures and thinking has anything to do with the electric currents that course along our nerves. These electric currents are the forces that are introduced into our being by the being I have just been describing. They do not belong to our being at all. There are electric currents in us, but they are of a purely aromatic nature. These beings of high intelligence, of a purely Mephistophelian intelligence, and of a will more akin to nature than can be said of our human will, these beings have decided out of their own will that they do not want to live in the world to which they were assigned by the wise gods of the upper hierarchies. They want to conquer the earth, so they need bodies. Having no bodies of their own, they use as much of human bodies as they can, since the human soul cannot quite fill out the human body. While a human body is developing, these beings can slip into it at a specific point before birth, and thereafter they accompany us beneath the threshold of our consciousness. But there is one aspect of human life which they cannot stand, and that is death. So they always have to depart from the human body they have invaded before it is afflicted by death. This is again and again a bitter disappointment for them, for what they so much want to succeed in is to remain in the human body beyond death. In their own kingdom this would be a high achievement for these beings, but so far they have failed in this. If the mystery of Golgotha had not taken place, if Christ had not passed through the mystery of Golgotha, these beings would long since have gained the ability on earth to remain in the human body after a karmically predetermined death. They would then have gained control over human evolution on earth and would have become the masters of this human evolution on the earth. It is of immensely profound importance for us to realize the connection between Christ's passage through the mystery of Golgotha and these beings who want to conquer death in human nature, but are as yet still unable to bear it. They must always take care not to be in the human being's body at the hour predetermined by that individual for his death. They must desist from maintaining that body beyond the hour of death, and from lengthening the life in that body from lasting beyond that hour of death. These matters have long been known to certain secret brotherhoods, who are very well informed about these things, yet have withheld this information from humanity at large. By what right we shall once again not investigate just now. But as things are today, it is quite wrong to desist from gradually arming people with such concepts, for they will need them when they have stepped through the gate of death. Everything we experience here, including what lies beneath the threshold of consciousness, is needed by us after death, when we have to look back to this life, and in this looking back must comprehend it. For being unable to do this is the worst thing that can happen to us. But our concepts for understanding this life, as we look back over it, are insufficient if we cannot throw light on a being who plays such a part in our life, as does this aromatic being who takes possession of us before birth, and is ever present as a feature of our subconscious. Our concepts for understanding this life are insufficient if we cannot throw light on these things, for wisdom is transformed into light after we die. These beings are very important for human life in every respect, and knowledge of them must and will gradually take hold in humanity. But this knowledge must take hold of people in the right way, and cannot be allowed to be spread around by secret brotherhoods who want to use it as a way of increasing their power. Nor, above all, may it be permitted to be kept secret as a means of increasing the power of certain brotherhoods who work egoistically. Humanity is striving to gain all-round knowledge, and such knowledge must be allowed to spread, for in future it will not be beneficial if secret brotherhoods can use such things as a means of spreading their own influence. Knowledge of these beings will increasingly have to take hold in humanity over the coming centuries. Over the coming centuries, human beings will increasingly need to know that they bear a double within them, an aromatic, Mephistophelian double. Human beings need to know this. Already they are developing a number of concepts which, however, remain rather meaningless because people do not yet know what to do about them. People are developing concepts which can only be properly comprehended once they are linked with the facts that underlie them. Something is opening up here which will in future definitely have to be pursued if humanity is not to meet with endless hindrances, endless frightful happenings. This double of whom I have been speaking is neither more nor less than the originator of all physical diseases that arise spontaneously from within. And to know this being fully is what is meant by organic medicine. Diseases that come spontaneously from within, not those caused by external injuries, do not come from the soul, but from this being who is the originator of all organic diseases that arise spontaneously from within. This being is the originator of all organic diseases, while his brother, whose nature is luciferic rather than aromatic, is the originator of all neuropsychological and neurotic diseases. All diseases which are not really diseases at all, but merely, as one says, nervous diseases, hysterical diseases, and so on. So medicine must become spiritual in two directions. The fact that this is required, is shown, as I mentioned in Zurich, by the way psychoanalysis, together with other ways of thinking, is coming to the fore, although it involves having to deal with spiritual entities while not knowing enough about them. So one is at a loss as to how to deal with phenomena that are entering more and more into human life. It will thus be necessary for certain things to happen. Even things that may be harmful in one respect must happen, because people need to be exposed to this harm in order to overcome it and gain strength by doing so. In order fully to understand all the things about which I have been speaking, that the double is the originator of all organic as opposed to merely functional diseases, one must know many other things as well. For example, one must know that our Earth is not the dead object described today in mineralogy or geology, but a living being. Mineralogy or geology know of the Earth as much as we would know of a person if we were familiar solely with the skeleton. Imagine never being able to see people with your senses, but only by means of X-rays. Think of being familiar only with someone's skeleton. If this were the case, you would know of the person as much as geologists, and indeed science as such, know about the Earth. Imagine coming in here and seeing nothing but the bones of all the members of our respected audience. You would then know as much about those present here as today's science knows about the Earth. The Earth, which is known only as a skeleton, is in reality a living organism, and as a living organism, it influences the beings who move about upon it, namely human beings themselves. Just as a human being is differentiated in the way his organs are distributed around his body, so is the earth differentiated in what it develops within it, which in turn influences the human beings moving about upon it. I expect you are aware of this when you consider that to think will necessitate using your head and not your right forefinger or the big toe on your left foot. You know perfectly well that you do not think with the big toe on your right foot, but with your head. Different things are distributed throughout a living organism. Such an organism is differentiated, and the earth is differentiated in the same way. Our earth is certainly not a being that sends up the same emanations to its inhabitants, wherever they may be. All kinds of different emanations come up out of the earth in different regions. There are various forces, magnetic, electrical, and so on, but also a great deal more in the living realm, which rise up out of the earth and influence human beings in manifold ways at different places on its surface. The influences on people vary depending on the geographical formations. This is an exceedingly important fact. There are few direct connections between the emanations rising up out of the earth and the human being in his configuration of body, soul, and spirit. But the double about whom I have been speaking is preeminently connected with the forces that stream up out of the earth. And because of this most intimate relationship between the double and what thus rises up, the human being in body, soul, and spirit is indirectly also connected with the earth and what emanates from it in different regions. These doubles, who as aromatic Mephistophelian beings take possession of human beings a short time before they are born, are partial in their nature to quite distinct flavors. There are those who are particularly partial to the Eastern Hemisphere, comprising Europe, Asia, and Africa, and therefore choose human beings who go there to be born and use their bodies. Others choose bodies born in the Western Hemisphere, in America. What we as human beings possess in a faint image as geography is experienced by these beings as a living principle, in accordance with which they choose their domicile. So you can see that one of the most important tasks of the future will be the cultivation of geographic medicine, medical geography, which, through Paracelsus, broke away from the old atavistic wisdom. Materialistic views have meant that since then it has received little cultivation. But it will gain ground once more when people get to know about the links between that being who makes human beings ill and the earth's geography. All those fusions and emanations that emerge from this earth in its various regions. It is indeed important for people to get to know about these things, for their very life depends on them. Through their double, they find themselves situated in earthly existence in a specific way, and this double has its dwelling place within them. These things have only really become so immeasurably important during the course of the fifth post-Atlantean epoch, and they will be especially important for humanity in the very near future. That is why spiritual science must now be made more widely known. This is particularly important because our age is calling on people to come to grips consciously with these things and relate to them in a conscious way. Human beings must be strong in this day and age in order to bring order into their relationship with these beings. The present epoch began in the 15th century, in 1413. The fourth post-Atlantean epoch, the Greco-Roman age, began before the mystery of Golgotha in 747 BC and lasted until AD 1413. Since then we have been living in the fifth post-Atlantean age. Its characteristics, which have been in preparation since the 15th century, are only now coming fully to the fore. During the fourth post-Atlantean epoch, it was the intellectual or mind soul which chiefly developed, whereas now it is the consciousness soul that is developing within human evolution as a whole. When human beings entered this age, it was their specific weakness with regard to the double which the leading spiritual beings had to take into account. If they had taken into their consciousness very much of all that is connected with the double, they would have fared badly, very badly. Even during the centuries preceding the 14th century, they had to be protected in advance, so that they would take in only very little that might in any way recall the double. That is why knowledge about the double, which certainly existed in more ancient times, came to be lost. People had to be protected not only against becoming aware of anything regarding the double as far as any theory about it went, but also so that they would come into contact as little as possible with anything to do with it. Something quite specific had to be arranged in order to achieve this. Try to understand this. During the centuries preceding the 14th century, people had to be protected against the double. The double had to disappear from people's view, and has only been permitted to reappear now in our age, when human beings must bring order into their relationship with it. For the double to disappear from people's view, a very significant arrangement had to be carried out, which it was only possible to set in train in the following way. Gradually from the 9th, the 10th century onward, the situation was created in Europe that caused Europeans to lose a certain contact which they had previously had. A contact that had been important for people of an earlier time, during the 7th, the 6th post-Christian centuries. Beginning from the 9th century and reaching a culmination in the 12th, all traffic with America, such as was possible with the ships of the time, was discontinued. This will no doubt sound rather strange to you, and you are likely to exclaim that history was never told you of such a thing. Well, in many ways history is a legend. For in centuries of European development long ago, ships did indeed set off from Norway, from what was then Norway, to America. Of course, it had a different name then, and was not called America. People knew about the region in America where especially those magnetic forces rise up which bring human beings into a relationship with the double. The most noticeable relations with the double emanate from that part of the earth which is covered by the American continent. And in those early centuries, people sailed in Norwegian boats to America, where they then studied diseases. Coming from Europe, people went to America to study the diseases caused by the Earth's magnetism. That is where we can find the mysterious origin of ancient European medicine. That is where it was possible to observe the course of diseases, which would not have been possible in Europe, where people were more susceptible to the influences of the double. Gradually it became necessary, and most of this was achieved by means of the edicts issued by the Roman Catholic Church, to make people forget the connection to America. And it was then not until the beginning of the 5th post-Atlantean epoch that America was rediscovered in a physical, sense-perceptible way. In fact, this was only a rediscovery, but it is nonetheless significant in the way it shows that the powers who had been at work had indeed succeeded in ensuring that nothing much at all concerning Europe's earlier connections with America was to be found in old records. And where there is some mention, it is not recognized for what it is, so that people do not realize that it refers to links between Europe and America in times long gone. The visits made in those ancient days were actually more than visits, although the Europeans did not become an American people in the way this became possible after the physical discovery, the physical rediscovery of America. In those early times, the Europeans visited in order to study what a very special role was played by the double in the race of the American Indians, who were different from them. For a while, before the fifth post-Atlantean time began to develop, people had to be protected against influences from the Western world. That is the significant historical arrangement that had to be set in train by wisdom-filled world powers. For a time, Europe had to be protected against all those influences, and this protection would have been impossible if the European world had not been totally closed in and shut off from America during the centuries that preceded the 15th century. During those preparatory centuries, it was necessary for a time to be very subtle in the way certain things were presented to the humanity of Europe. What I mean to say is that the understanding that was to gain ground preeminently during this fifth post-Atlantean age had to be very tenderly nurtured when it first appeared. What was to be revealed in that understanding had to be brought in with the utmost subtlety. Sometimes that subtlety was, of course, like the subtlety in education, when in certain circumstances quite considerable punishment has to be meted out. But what I am talking about now refers to the grand impulses of history. Thus, it came about that Irish monks, under the influence of the pure Christian esoteric doctrine that was forming in Ireland, worked in a way that persuaded Rome of the necessity to close Europe off from the Western Hemisphere. It was from Ireland that the movement emanated, which during the centuries prior to the fifth post-Atlantean epoch sought to spread Christianity in Europe in a way that would leave it undisturbed by everything rising up out of the subterranean regions of the earth in the Western Hemisphere. This is perhaps a good point at which to say a few words about these things. Columban and St. Gall were preeminent individuals in that great and important missionary effort which sought to Christianize Europe by surrounding it with spiritual walls, so that no influences of the kind I have described would come in. Individuals like Columban and his pupil Gall, to whom this place here owes its foundation and its name, realized that the delicate plant of Christianization could only spread in Europe if Europe were surrounded by a kind of fence, spiritually speaking. There are indeed profound and significant secrets hidden behind the processes of world history, and the history taught in our schools is in many ways a legend. Among the most important facts to be taken into account in an effort to understand more recent times in Europe is this. From the centuries during which Christianity was spread from Ireland throughout Europe, right up to the 12th century, efforts were made, especially by means of the papal edicts, to place a taboo on maritime traffic between Europe and America and put a stop to it, so that the links between America and Europe came to be completely forgotten. This forgetting was necessary, so that the first period of the development of the fifth post-Atlantean era in Europe should be worked through in the right way. Only when the age of materialism began was America rediscovered. Then America was discovered under the influence of the greed for gold, under the influence of a purely materialistic culture with which people have to reckon in the fifth post-Atlantean era, and with which they must establish an appropriate relationship. These are the things that are genuine history, and they are what throw light on what is real. The earth has to be described as a living being. It has geographical differentiations in the way the most varied forces stream up out of all kinds of different terrestrial regions. That is why human beings must not be separated off according to terrestrial region, but must take on from one another whatever each region can uniquely produce in the way of what is good and great. And that is why the worldview of spiritual science is mindful of the need to create something that can be truly accepted by all nations in all regions. Human beings must progress through a mutual exchange of their spiritual riches. It is this that is crucial. Individual terrestrial regions, on the other hand, easily engender the endeavor to increase power and more power. The great danger of newer human evolution going forward in a one-sided way can only be assessed on the basis of really concrete conditions. If one knows about the earth being an organism, and if one knows what is really emanating from different points on the globe. In the eastern part of Europe, there is relatively little tendency with regard to power, because for Russians, for example, although they are intimately bound up with the soil, the special forces that have to be taken up from the ground are forces which do not stem from the earth. The mystery of Russian geography tells us that what Russians take up out of the earth is, first and foremost, the light which has been bestowed on the earth and is then given back. So Russians absorb from the earth something that has streamed into it from outer regions. Russians love their soil, but they love it because for them it mirrors the heavens. So however terrestrial or territorial their cast of mind might be, this territorial attitude, although at present remaining at a childlike level, is extraordinarily cosmopolitan, because as the earth moves through space, it comes into touch with all the many parts of its surroundings. To take into the soul not what streams in the earth from below upward, but what first came from above downward and then streams upward again from below, is different from taking in something which, in that it streams up directly out of the earth, is given a certain kinship with human nature. What Russians love about their soil, what fills them to the brim, gives them a good many weaknesses, but it also gives them some ability to overcome that nature of the double about which I was speaking just now. So it will be the Russians who will be called upon to provide the most important impulses in the age when the time will finally have come to do battle with that double, namely in the 6th post-Atlantean era. There is one specific part of the earth's underlying ground which has the greatest kinship with those forces. When people go there, they enter into that sphere of influence, but when they go away again, they are no longer influenced in that way. These are geographical forces. This is not a matter of ethnicity or nationality, but purely of geography. The region where that which streams upward from below has the greatest influence on the double, and where, because of this kinship with the double, it reflects back to the earth as well, this is the region where most of the mountain ranges do not cross from west to east, but run mainly from north to south, where the magnetic North Pole is nearby, for this too is connected with those forces. This is the region where, through the prevailing external conditions, above all, a kinship is developed with the Mephistophelian aromatic nature. This kinship has many effects on the further development of the earth. So people must not go along blindly with the earth's development, for they must see and understand these conditions. Europe will only be able to enter into a right relationship with America when such conditions are seen and understood, when people know which geographical conditions are determining what comes from there. But if Europe persists in being blind to these things, then this unfortunate Europe's fate will be like the fate of Greece with regard to Rome. This must not be allowed to happen. The world must not be allowed to become geographically Americanized. But this presupposes that we understand what is meant. Things must be taken far more seriously than is frequently the case today. What happens is based on deep foundations. So knowledge is needed, and not merely sympathies and antipathies, in order to gain a stance with regard to the circumstances in which present-day humanity so tragically finds itself now. We can speak in more detail about these things here, whereas this isn't possible in public lectures. Yesterday I mentioned the importance of bringing spiritual science right into social and political concepts, for it is America's endeavor to mechanize everything, to push everything into the realm of pure naturalism, thus gradually extinguishing Europe's culture altogether. Of course, the concepts I am referring to are geographical, not national. You need only think of someone like Emerson in order to realize that what I am referring to is not a matter of national characteristics. Emerson was a human being thoroughly steeped in the culture of Europe. As you see, there are two opposing poles that are evolving. Under the very influences I have been speaking about today, some develop like Emerson and confront the double with their full humanity, while others develop like Woodrow Wilson and become merely a garment for the double, so that the double works particularly strongly through them. These latter are like embodiments of America's geographical nature. All this has nothing to do with any kind of sympathy or antipathy, nor with taking sides in any way. It is to do with knowing about the deeper reasons for what people live through during their lives. Humanity will not find much help if it fails to reach clarity about what is actually at work. Today it is very necessary to reconnect with much that had to be severed at the turning point when the way to America was barred. Human beings like St. Gall can stand as symbols of what you can experience and feel in this connection. They had to create a foundation for their work by means of the barrier they set up. These are things that one must understand. It is spiritual science that can create genuine historical understanding. But as you see, it will of course be met by prejudice after prejudice. For what can one expect but that knowledge will be made to support the views of one party or another? This was one of the reasons for the cowardice that made certain secret brotherhoods hold back with these things. They held back for the simple reason that people often find knowledge uncomfortable, for they do not want to become generally human. This applies particularly to those who have an inclination to link up with the geographical forces streaming up out of the earth. Matters of public life will surely gradually become questions of knowledge and be lifted out of the atmosphere, out of the sphere of mere sympathies and antipathies, into which they are being forced today by the great majority of humanity. It will, though, not be majorities that decide what is effective. But what is effective will only be able to be effective if people stop shying away from taking important matters into their consciousness. What I have spoken about today, because if I might put it like this, the genius loci of this place expected it of me, has been based on a specific example, namely the fact that to get to know history, it is now no longer sufficient for people to consult the usual historical textbooks, since what these tell us in the name of history is nothing but a legend. What they do tell us about, the important seafaring routes, lie at the hidden root of medicine, and which people followed from Europe to America even in the early centuries of Christianity. Let me read that again. What do they tell us about the important seafaring routes which lie at the hidden root of medicine, and which people followed from Europe to America, even in the early centuries of Christianity? Yet what exists does not cease to exist, if people later on make their consciousness blind to it, like ostriches burying their heads in the sand, and then believing that what they cannot see does not exist. Many other things, too, are now hidden from view by that legend which people call history, things that are now quite close to what present-day people do. Many things about the course of human history will be brought out into the light by spiritual science, for people want to be enlightened about their own destiny and about how their soul is linked with their spiritual development. Much, then, that has been lost to history can only be rediscovered by spiritual science. Or else humanity will have to decide to remain in the dark, even about some matters that are very relevant. Spiritual science alone can provide a standpoint from which to judge the present time, even though we are all so exceedingly well informed about it. But how exactly are we so well informed? With all due respect, as one says nowadays when one intends to say something impolite, with all due respect, it is the press that informs us by disguising the very aspects that are essential, true, and real. In other words, the aspects that matter. Yet people need to reach this degree of reality in what they know. This is not meant as a criticism of the press, either personally or impersonally, but it is meant as a statement about something that is at work in the present time, something that cannot help being as it is. Things cannot be other than they are, but people must be aware of this. It is a great mistake to believe that one must criticize things, for what one must do is characterize them. That is what matters. Today I have tried to give you a picture of certain impulses at work in the individual human being and in humanity as a whole. Apart from the specific details I have mentioned, I also wanted the type of impulses I have touched on to give you, above all, a sense of how human beings must be aware that with their whole being they are embedded in a real spiritual world filled with real spiritual beings and real spiritual forces. Not only do we wake up into that world into which we step after death, and in which we live between death and a new birth, but we also learn to understand the physical world by being in it while knowing about the spiritual world at the same time. We can only understand the physical world if we also understand the spiritual world. Medicine can only endure if it is a spiritual science. Diseases come from a spiritual being that is only using the human body in order to find its due, which it cannot find at the place intended for it by the wisdom-filled leadership of the world against which it has rebelled, as I have shown. It is a being, actually an aromatic Mephistophelian being, living in the human being's physical nature, a being who takes the human body as its domicile before birth, and who only leaves this human body because it must not be allowed to endure death under the circumstances holding sway in the present time, and because also it cannot conquer death. Diseases arise because this being works in the human being. The purpose of using medical remedies is to give this being something belonging to the external world, something which it otherwise seeks to find through the human being. By giving the human body a medical remedy, when that aromatic Mephistophelian being is at work there, I am giving it something else. I am as though caressing that being, reconciling it, so that it leaves the human being in peace and gains satisfaction instead from the medical remedy. I am throwing down its throat. But we are only at the very beginning of all these things. Medicine will become a spiritual science. And just as medicine was known to be a spiritual science in olden times, so will it come to be recognized as such again. Another feeling that I will have awoken in you is that it is necessary not only to acquire a few concepts from spiritual science, but also to feel one's way into it. By doing this, one also feels one's way into the human being. The time has come when the scales will fall from our eyes in many respects. For example, also in respect of external history. A few days ago in Zurich, I proved, or rather showed, that history is not viewed by us from outside, but that we dream it in reality, and that we only understand it if we take it as belonging to the dream of humanity, and not as something or other that runs its course in the outer world. It is to be hoped that these things will also be carried further by the power that has so far taken hold only of quite a small and all too small section of humanity in what we call the anthroposophical movement. This anthroposophical movement will, nevertheless, be connected with all that will have to lead humanity to its most important affairs in the future. We have often remembered a comparison I have frequently drawn. The clever people out there think to themselves, well, all those anthroposophists and theosophists, they are one of those sects with all kinds of fantastic stuff and foolish ideas in their heads. Those of us who belong to the enlightened section of humanity should take care to have nothing to do with them. With modifications, owing to the fact that time has moved on, that, quote, enlightened section of humanity, close quote, is thinking along the same lines about those subterranean, sectarian assemblages of anthroposophists and theosophists, as did the Romans, the distinguished Romans, when Christianity first began to spread. The Christians of those times actually had to descend into physical catacombs, while up above them all the things went on which those distinguished Romans considered right and proper, while those fantastical Christians were down below. But once a few centuries had passed, things had changed. The Roman world had been swept away, and what had been down below in the catacombs had risen to the surface. What had once dominated culture had been torn up by its roots. Such comparisons must strengthen our resolve. Such comparisons must take up residence in our souls, so that we can draw strength from them while we still have to work in such small circles. The movement characterized by this anthroposophical stream must develop the strength that can really come up from below, even though up here little understanding for its spiritual foundations awaits it. Nevertheless, we must not cease thinking back to happenings like the existence of the early Christians in the catacombs, which, even though it was far more subterranean than is the anthroposophical movement today, still found its way up to the surface. Some of those who wrestle with spiritual concepts in this anthroposophical movement have already found the possibility of working with that light in the sphere where spiritual concepts, which are wisdom here, unfold as light. We are able to repeat again and again that among the members who work in the anthroposophical movement, we are as close to those who are here in the physical world as we are to those who are already over there in the supersensible world, having stepped through the gate of death. Over there today they bear out the truth of what is gained here by way of spiritual wisdom. There are already a good many member souls living in the supersensible world about whom we should be thinking. At this moment I am thinking once again about Sophie Stinde, who worked so faithfully at the Goetheanum because the anniversary of her physical death is approaching again, her supersensible birthday into spiritual life. Dear friends, if we truly wish to take our place in the positive anthroposophical movement, what we have to do is deepen the feeling that tells us, through what is genuinely connected with us, we take in the concrete concept of the spiritual world. So, dear friends, times are difficult indeed. We know how hard it will be to get through the coming weeks. Whatever may happen as regards our meeting again on the physical plane, however long or short the time may be until we can come together again here, let me say to you that in order to preserve and strengthen our endeavors in spiritual science, we shall, despite everything, feel ourselves to be together and think ourselves to be together, even though we are separate from one another in space. Let us remain always together, as those who strive in spiritual science.